Okay, it is 1300 Eastern Daylight Time. Folks are just getting in now, so I'll give maybe another minute or two, let everybody get into the webinar here, and then we will get started. All right, looks like we're about at a plateau here with attendees. It's still going up a little bit, but let's get started. So welcome everyone to the second in a series of our Mad Scientist events in partnership with the Georgetown University Center for Security Studies. And welcome into my home as well. All at the moment, around 200 of you. We'll fit everybody. I have a blow-up mattress in the closet, so don't worry about that. I'm Matt Sansford. I'm part of the Army Mad Scientist Initiative. Mad Scientist is a U.S. Army initiative that continually explores the future of warfare, challenges assumptions, and collaborates with academia, industry, and government. You can follow us on Twitter at Army MadSci, and don't forget to subscribe to our blog if you haven't already. The Mad Scientist Laboratory at madsciblog.tradoc.army.mil. And this year we've been exploring the theme of information weaponization. And today we're very excited to have two proclaimed mad scientists as our guests on this topic, Mr. Peter Singer and Mr. August Cole. Peter W. Singer is a strategist at New America. He's been named by the Smithsonian as one of the nation's 100 leading innovators, by Defense News as one of the 100 most influential people in defense issues, and by Foreign Policy to their top 100 global thinkers list. Peter is the author of multiple best-selling and award-winning books, both fiction and nonfiction, including Ghost Fleet, Like War, and his latest with August Cole that came out yesterday, Burning. His past work includes serving at the Office of the Secretary of Defense, Harvard University, an editor at Popular Science magazine, and as the founding director of the Center for 21st Century Security and Intelligence at Brookings, where he was the youngest person named senior fellow in its 100-year history. August Cole is an author exploring the future of conflict through fiction and other forms of fiction intelligence or fic in storytelling, excuse me. His talks, short stories, and workshops have taken him from speaking at the Nobel Institute in Oslo to presenting at South by Southwest Interactive to tackling the dirty name obstacle at Fort Benning. With the aforementioned Peter W. Singer, he's the co-author of the bestseller Ghost Fleet and Burning. And he's the non-resident senior fellow at the Brent Scowcroft Center on Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council. He works on creative futures at Spark Cognition and is a regular speaker to private sector, academia, and U.S. and allied government audiences. So gentlemen, welcome to the webinar.
Thanks for having us.
Great to be here.
Thanks, August. So we're going to start off the discussion here between myself and Mr. Singer and Mr. Cole, and then we'll jump right into the audience Q&A for the remainder of the hour. So let's start with you, Peter. As I mentioned in the opening, we're looking to explore the weaponization of information, both by state actors, non-state actors, through social media, run the full gamut. Can you talk a little bit about those themes as they relate to your book that tackled those subjects like war?
Oh, wow. Well, first, again, I really want to thank you and the whole team behind this for putting it together, and also appreciate everybody virtually coming out to join us. It's exciting to be able to talk about these projects. And I would add, I think as a start to it, because it's important, the projects they originated from before the pandemic, and yet I think are all the more important because of it. Both the look at the weaponization of information on social media, but also what Burning looks at, which is the forces of AI and automation. If we look at on the pandemic side, we have seen a lot of the key issues that we explored in Like War play out in the real world, whether it was the sheer scale of information that's out there that provides a new tool of intelligence and understanding. No one can say about the coronavirus pandemic that we didn't know or that we weren't warned. All the data was out there, not just in what we now know of the secret intelligence reports, but it was all out there in the open too. For example, I did an article for Defense One in early February that looked at what we were seeing on Chinese internet of that the government there was downplaying the severity of the outbreak. It was censoring, it was spreading false information about how good it was responding. And then finally, it was shifting to blame casting for others. That was all out in the open in early February. And then in turn, you've seen the very same tactics of downplaying, uplifting false information, and blame shifting. That's been things that we've seen in the US political system too, unfortunately. And we've also seen an accompanying infodemic. That's not my term. That's actually been used by medical professionals that have talked about how this weaponization of disinformation and misinformation on everything from the severity of coronavirus to who's to blame for it, to most recently medical treatments that don't work for it, that this infodemic has actually cost lives, and not in ones and twos, but in thousands. And part of, in fact, the co-chairs of the Cyber Solarium Commission said it's a quote, a matter of quote, life or death now in dealing with the information epidemic that goes along with it. And those themes carry into the world of burn-in, where part of what they are about is the networking of the world. The networking that means that on one hand, we have a far greater scale of information, including because as you change to an Internet of Things, you have every thing out there is collecting, whether it's a smartphone, whether it's a car, whether it's your home, they're collecting information. And in turn, we're networked and we can all share it. But as it becomes more intelligent, it allows us to understand more, not just history, but to predict, to even influence. But we can also do that on scale like never before, but micro-target it. It can go after the individual, whether it is the individual online being force-fed political influence activities, or the opening scene of Burn-In is someone walking into Washington, D.C. train station, and ads are popping up for them that are tailored to that individual. And those forces of change are amazing. And they're, like this group straight out of sci-fi, but they're now real. But what it also means is that, and this will give sort of a hint of, the kind of sci-fi we pull from, you may have robots and AI, it's not the world of WALL-E. It's more like Gibson. You have uneven distribution, and it's not just who has the technology or not, but uneven distribution of, yes, you've got AI and robotics, but and you go into Union Station and there's face recognition and there's ads popping. There's homeless still outside. There's criminals still, and in fact, these forces of change are, whether you're looking at the weaponization of information or what's happening in automation, they're driving a new undercurrent of frustration and even more distancing and distrust. And that those forces are going to be with us for the long term. And again, I think we can kind of feel that it was in the air before coronavirus, and it feels like it's even more coming out of it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. We talk about disinformation campaigns, and we think of them in Mad Scientist as governmental or military or political, and you can take something like a virus, which is seemingly apolitical, but nothing's out of bounds in that realm. So August, you recently supported a NATO Innovation Hub initiative that asked you to envision what NATO operations could look like in 2040. So why is this sort of exercise important to national security? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, and thanks again for having us on. I'd like to say hello to anyone in Australia who's still up trying to stagger through this. We appreciate you being in the audience. These sorts of stories like Pete has described, whether it's a novel like Burn-In, whether it's this short story that I recently wrote for the NATO Innovation Hub called Known Enemies, are in a very effective way at fusing together so many different forces that if you use just traditional foresight metrics, you may not really capture their true impact on society, and particularly from a very human perspective. The way that we often approach world building tends to become very technologically dominated. And while it is, I think, really important to be able to, in effect, teach people through, this kind of fiction, whether it's this FICINT concept or useful fiction, we also are connecting at a very human level by using characters. And so in the use of a short story as almost like an auxiliary or a supplement, or even like a red team perspective to a conventional foresight activity about, let's say, 2040, as was in this case, you're allowing, in a sense, a richer conversation about what that world might be like. Because there's a pretty good chance that the worlds as they're depicted are going to go from existing in a very traditional kind of siloed or heavily categorized way to one that's a lot more, messy, to use the technical word. So the world that I was playing with in 2040 for this concept was thinking through what it would be like to have an alliance with the legacy of NATO when the actual standing army was becoming an economic and even political liability in Europe, in part because of these larger trends around, the end of, functional work as we may see it in the next 2 decades due to automation and AI. And this sort of tension between these two forces, one which is the removal of the human from activities that have formed the basis of Western, societies, the industrial age, colliding with this kind of traditional imperative to, protect one's nation, to be able to exert will in the world in a coercive way. And so I used, France as a country, as obviously a NATO member that has had a long history and debate around the use of force and participation. And so the way that I explored that wasn't by having them, fight Russia or China, but rather thinking about, especially in this disinformation information domain, the cognitive domain, who would be the adversary, and what if it's not a nation state? What if it's more of like an open source insurgency that yet uses the same tools or more advanced tools that are also enabled by AI, bioprinting, and that sort of thing? Again, if you try to draw that world or describe that world in a linear sense, in a non-fictional sense, it's going to take you 70 or 80 pages. You can do it in 5,000 words in a short story and maybe not have the same depth, but allow someone to wrap their head around something so that they can start asking more questions, starting to pursue their own instincts, doing their own research in terms of what that world might actually look like.
Can I jump in on that? Because August, this term FICINT that you've particularly popularized. One of the things that's interesting about it is it's important. It's a tool, just like human and SIGINT. It's one of many tools, and you want them all. So it doesn't mean the end of other forms. But one of the things that we discovered, and was came out of the Ghost Fleet experience. It didn't start with that kind of intentionality. Is 3 real values of FICINT, or what we call useful fiction. One is that it has the potential of reaching more people, including all the way up at the highest levels. So August is referencing these short stories. So I'm gonna cheerlead my partner on it. One of them for Norway, for example, reaches their Minister of Defense in a way that a report from a war game wouldn't. We experienced this certainly with Ghost Fleet, where I've obviously done nonfiction books that have done well and been on military reading lists, but it was Ghost Fleet that got me invited to brief everywhere from the White House Situation Room to the tank for the Joint Chiefs to the like. But what we get at is no one ever said, man, that was such a great PowerPoint. You ought to read it on your next flight, or you ought to read it on your next vacation. They will do that about a novel, a short story, or the like. But the second thing is, to put our scientist hats on, they actually have greater impact. They stick with people. It hits our brains in a different way. And that's because story is the oldest human technology of all for communication. Our brains can't help ourselves but to put ourselves into that environment, what's called a synthetic environment. And in fact, the data shows that it hits with a harder effect than even the most canonical academic sources when policymakers gather to debate action. But the third is that strangely, it doesn't just stick in your brain, it hits your emotions and makes things, the way August put it, real. In a way that sometimes nonfiction doesn't. And for us in Burn-In, it's, we gathered all of this hard data on, for example, we built a data set of over 1,300 projections of job automation. everything from what the World Bank said was going to happen to what McKinsey said was going to happen. There's all these reports out there. We did that. But what made it real is when we took those data in the Excel spreadsheet and lived it through a character in burn-in. So, one character who's a lawyer who's been bottomated. They've been moved into doing distance gig work. And so you take those numbers, but it feels real to you by reading about how they're, how it's affecting their family, how it's affecting their marriage.
Yeah, I think those are great points. PowerPoints are great for conveying information, but storytelling really gets your audience invested in what's happening to the point where they can relate to it. So pulling on that, so you both wrote Ghost Fleet and you just published Burn-In. Can you, and you were talking a little bit about it in your answer there, Peter. Can you talk to us about the role FICINT played in those stories and kind of how you formed that? And this can go to either one of you.
Right, August, why don't you do the rules of FICINT, because that I think is really cool to share with people.
So one of the ways that we think about this FICINT concept is its utility, and having a clear sense of what it is and what it isn't, I think, is really, really important too. And of course, it fits within the kind of genre of sci-fi, and it allows you to kind of categorize it as that sort of fictional work. But one of the really critical elements, and this is something that was true for both Ghost Fleet and Burn-In, is usually true for the short stories that I write, is that the technology in there should be real or in development. And the reason why is that helps people, I think, understand that when you're taking technologies into the future, that many of the same rules, like Murphy's Law, like Clausewitz's fog of war, are going to apply. And it helps kind of burst the bubble of techno-optimism that often develops when people get really vested in a certain platform, a certain capability, a certain operating concept. And I think that's really critical. Another is, that FICINT really should, I think, focus on characters, as we've said, and try to show their world in an authentic way, so that people behave as people behave. That there are aspects to their lives and existences that are really important. How you show that in a story can also be a way to build credibility with the reader. I think that's also critical. And another facet too is, the usage of fact and data is of course critical. Endnotes are, in the novels, for example, a really effective way to do that. But there is a bit of a balance between, can you have too much or too little? And so really, I think working to not lard something up so that it's unreadable or unwieldy, that it still feels and reads like a proper story, is when you're really going to, I think, produce something that connects with as many people as possible. And I think the last thing I'd say too is that, another rule is that, if technology is going to be increasingly driving the kinds of situations that we're writing FICINT type short stories or graphic novels about, we have to consider how that affects not only characters, but whether technology itself is almost its own sort of character. And yet at the same time, AI, for example, it's a family of sort of software research, if you want to call it that, and it's invisible. And so I think manifesting these trend lines in ways that are obvious and relatable through people, through more than technology, is a great way to kind of bring that technology that's pervasive and invisible into the conversation in a much more direct and accessible way. Because ultimately, we have to live in that world that we're creating, and that's what we want to start doing when we sit down to write FICINT. Pete, you want to pick it up?
Yeah, the rule of or we call them the rules of the real. The one on the technology side is the no vaporware rule. So whatever technology appears, it has to have some kind of grounding. Either it already exists or it's already at prototype stage. It can't be pulled out of thin air. And that's what distinguishes it from fantasy. And frankly, some forms of science fiction. It's also, a flaw, I would say, of a lot of, you even see those in real world military games or acquisition programs. It'll be, well, we're going to have this. And you're like, are you really? Show me where it already is in the lab, or who already, and no, we'll surely have it by then. That also means that another rule of the real is a real world timeline, and very appropriate to this group that's meeting is what a great scientist, but even greater science fiction writer, Arthur C. Clarke, once talked about, which is once you start to move more than a generation ahead, you start to dance in the realm of magic rather than science. And so while we don't put specific dates in the books, it's very clear that this is not something taking place 100 years from now or the like, because yet again, that's so far off that you can't ground it. To what August raised, you can't put an end note for it. You can't show that that's happened. The other is the rule of the real people means that their actions might have been something that happened in the real world. So for us, a key issue is cyber attacks. Don't want to plot spoil too much, but bad guys do certain things that cause really, really bad things to happen in Washington, D.C. But we show, hey, this actually could happen with, here's where this kind of breach has already taken place somewhere else. One just a couple weeks ago was announced in Israel. Someone went after the water treatment systems and the chlorine levels. And if you think that the small town water treatment plants upriver on the Potomac River have better cybersecurity than the Israeli government, I've got really, really bad news for you. Or it might be something that is not, the breach hasn't happened yet, but someone's shown off the vulnerability, done it at a hacker convention or a threat report or something like that. And that grounds it, and that keeps it in that space of being useful and fiction. But the other side that isn't talked about enough is the fiction building side. It's got to have compelling stories, characters that you either want to love or love to hate. Our funny experience with that was after Ghost Fleet, someone approached us and said, Ghost Fleet's had this kind of influence, so we're going to do a Ghost Fleet but for healthcare policy. And we said, oh, that's cool. What's your story? What's your plot? What's your characters? And they said, we're going to do a Ghost Fleet, but for healthcare policy. And we're like, sorry, that's not how it works. Like, we work really, really hard at the world building and characters. And so you're serving these two masters. And hopefully that combination is what makes it something that either for some people, they don't care about the real world side, they just want something escapist. For other people, it's the utility. But you don't get the utility if it's boring.
I think that's a great point. I think keeping it grounded really does lend that credibility to that this is a believable world. So sticking with FICINT here, because we're delving into it and we're exploring what it is. How does FICINT help us think about the future, and how can FICINT help the Army and particularly mad scientists, because we are always exploring the future? How can we use that to learn about the future?
I'll start with this. I mean, I think one of the best approaches that can be taken is to have a crowdsourced or kind of big tent approach to getting people to write from as many different perspectives and backgrounds and experiences as possible. And I think that's, for the Mad Scientist program, one of the strongest attributes about the way that you've approached this, because it's very easy to try to exclude people by saying they don't have the expertise or the insight. But I think would be a really misguided form of like gatekeeping, because the way that we're seeing technology, for example, proliferate around the world, particularly those technologies that are tactically or strategically significant, especially in the information space, that doesn't follow the conventional organizational patterns or buckets that we want to put in, foe or friend, adversary or ally. And so being able to navigate a world where good ideas can come from anywhere, that is certainly how I think our most challenging adversaries are approaching that same kind of intellectual quest for edge. And so to me, that is like a prima facie, really important approach to using, something like FICINT, which is to say good ideas can come from anywhere. And throughout, I think in the conversation so far too, this emphasis on character and narrative, which is really hard. I mean, it's hard for us to develop, and it's hard for first-time writers too, but I think really does pay off, because when you can connect with people by creating characters who are relatable, you can reach so many more people. I mean, that's what I think helps a good book, for example, break out of a certain genre or niche. And the same is true in trying to reach people within different government communities or different branches or departments, for that matter, in the defense establishment as well. The other aspect too is, we don't know how fast the future is coming, and which technologies are going to affect others, either in direct consequence or maybe developing in parallel. Social movements can develop at the same time as great breakthroughs in business or in engineering. A good example would be like the age of jet travel and the civil rights movement. Both developed around the same time. They weren't related necessarily, but it's the sort of thing that transformed America over the course of decades. Thinking about AI and automation from robotics, we're looking at that happening at the same time as we're seeing a real resurgence in populism in the U.S. and also in our allied countries, partner countries in Europe as well, which poses some really interesting challenges when those start to collide. If I were trying to think through that, the way I approach it is to try to make sense of it in a fictional narrative, so that I can capture all of those disparate elements that wouldn't ordinarily get briefed together, and try to paint a picture of a world that is not necessarily the future, because I would hate for someone to think that any one person has an authoritative voice, on exactly what's going to happen. But we can, I think, identify trend lines and where they're pointing, and use narratives to get pretty close to some of the really important events for the perspectives that we're trying to write from and understand the future.
And that, you see those in particular related to the topic of artificial intelligence, which is, in Burn-In what we explore, but of course is a crucial topic for the Army, but the wider US military. I mean, AI is at the heart of the national defense strategy, as well as, the strategy of pretty much every Fortune 500 company out there, is that first you have a disconnect between organizations thinking that it's important, and yet their awareness of its key issues, even the key terms. One study, a poll actually, only 17% of leaders said that they had a familiarity with AI, let alone its applications and dilemmas. Compare that to a leadership saying, this is the most important thing for our future. And so go back to how we were talking about, how do you go after that? Well, one, you could say, hey, everybody, read this white paper on AI and its applications. And that's probably not going to happen among, everything from most senior Army leadership down to Lieutenant so-and-so in the field. But maybe you can go after it through some informed fiction that importantly is not the narrative of killer robots and robot revolt, but it's more about, okay, what are the real world plans for its applications, but let's play it out in a scenario. But the other thing is that in good world building, you go after the second problem that we particularly face, I think in broadly in military planning, but also in how we study these issues, is that we come at it from one angle, one perspective. So there are lots of people talking and exploring about the issues of AI and automation, but weirdly for a topic that is about networks, it's stovepiped. The people who work on the future of war are different and having not related conversations to the people who are working on the future of work, and are different from the people who work on cybersecurity or the Internet of Things, and are different from the people who care about law and ethics, or the people who care about social movements and changes in politics, like what August brought up. And so one value of this approach is that you, by the sheer nature of world building and having different kind of characters, you draw in these different perspectives, and it allows you to examine something from kind of, you walk in that path and you see what the character is experiencing, not just out on the battlefield, but what are they experiencing at home? And in turn, we can draw research. So yes, we've got, a way of sharing with you. Here's job automation data that, oh, by the way, has Army specialties that parallel each of this. But here's also, what's next for an unmanned system. And you can get both of it at the same time.
Well, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, based on August's comment about crowdsourcing, that Mad Scientist is currently running a crowdsourcing event on information weaponization. So I'm sure Ian Kersey has hit it in the chat where you can find out information on that. I implore everyone in the attendees list to check that out and submit something to us. I'd like to move on now to Peter. You're an editor with Popular Science. What are your thoughts regarding the strengths and weaknesses of China's ongoing effort to weaponize information? And what about others like Russia, North Korea, Iran, and non-state actors?
So one of the big changes that we've seen in the last several weeks of the coronavirus period is something that was in play, but it was a shift. And literally you can see this shift in numeric terms, appropriate enough, using AI to track on scale what's playing out on social networks, is China, and roughly it started, I'm going to get the date wrong, so don't hold me exactly to it, but roughly around the period of, I believe, like March 9th to 12th, they kick into gear a pretty massive campaign of trying to change global discussion around coronavirus, and particular blame shifting, sowing false narrative, and wonderful contradictory stories of where coronavirus emerged from. Maybe it came from Taiwan. No, maybe it came from Italy. And you're like, it can't have been both, but that, and it's a mirror of the Russian play and what we see on domestic politics, bury the truth underneath a sea of lies. And that activity kicked into high gear around that period. It's sort of, you can see a spike and you can see the narratives go up. But then the other thing that's happened is it's not clear that it's pure coordination. It's more like cohesion. Russian and Chinese information warfare efforts kind of not just mirroring each other, but elevating. So Chinese actors in this space elevating RT conspiracy theory or the like. Those are two big changes that have just happened in the last several months, and they're with us for the long term now. More broadly, what you see is two different approaches to information and information control, whether it is information warfare, what we call like war, trying to shape, not to cyber war hack networks, but like war hack the people on the networks through these influence operations, or more broadly, how we use AI in terms of battlefield, social control, larger, sometimes people frame it as an arms race. Simply put, the Chinese model, which they have been very open, they want to be the world leader in AI by the year 2030, is highly centralized in that there is a government strategy and it has chosen national champions, a certain limited number of big tech companies, and in turn, the information flow, anything and everything flows to government. And that will allow a smarter AI that can be deployed out into war, but will also allow a level of social control. And it's called the social credit system, where you will have, in the words of the description of the score, a single score that measures your, quote, trustworthiness, end quote, in the eyes of the government. And so it will track everything from your online posts, what you say, to how long you play video games, to whether you buy diapers or not, to it looks like now it's going to have health data, not just your temperature, but whether you exercised or not that day. All that data flowing not just through Tencent, Baidu, but all the way to the government, centralized. The US system is more a cacophony. And it's funny because it's sort of the opposite of what we did in the Manhattan Project. It's not government bringing everything together. Instead, you've got certain government, and August and I will plot spoil. Yes, we're going to have AI, more advanced AI and robots in the future, but we do not believe that government bureaucracy is going to get it together. And so different government agencies will have networks that might not communicate well, or different, one government agency with a better budget than the other is going to have slightly more advanced robot. And so when they show up at the same emergency, not everybody shows up with the same level of information or the same bots. I think we're pretty confident in that prediction. So you got this cacophony within government, but more importantly, you've got, each private sector doing its own research on AI to doing its own collection activities. And some of it's shared and some of it's not. So, Google's got its program, which is different than Amazon or Microsoft. And some of that is available to government, and large parts of it will not be available to government because it's going to be monetized. And so in the US, when you walk through this world, it will be very different than if you were walking through Beijing of the future. And again, going back to what we were talking about, it also means that dependent where you are in society, whether you're the FBI agent or you're the criminal, or you're the civilian who's a lawyer, to the 5-year-old kid, and also which neighborhood you're in, a wealthy enclave or a poor community, you'll have different experiences, different perspectives, including whether you think it's good or bad.
Well, speaking for myself, I'm glad we're not on the social credit system, because there's an inverse relationship between the amount of time I spend playing video games and the amount of time I spend exercising. So that's a plus for me. So the next question is for either of you. How is AI and machine learning being used to power disinformation and information operations? And what are the implications, not just for the operational environment abroad, but the homeland as well, at a time when that same technology is going to rewire our economy?
I'll start off with that, Pete. The challenge here is you're dealing with technology that moves so fast that, in the same way in the cyber realm, where defense and offense is moving at that machine learning or speed of light, the information domain is also moving that fast. And what I find really interesting is you can have the real world implications of online campaigns start to shape not only events, but perhaps even more importantly, narratives. The tug and the ebb and flow, or the tug of war over which parts of the country should open up when, is clearly a contested point in the information campaign, at a strategic level right now. You look at some of the great power, objectives of a country like Russia or China, and it can line up with that sort of embrittling, if you will, of America's fault lines, or at least widening them. Carnegie Mellon had a report that just came out. It's like half of the bot traffic around the open movement half of the social media traffic around the open movement is from bots. That's not an expensive, attack surface to exploit, but it requires some resources and kind of considered effort. Imagine that in a great power context. Imagine like the Ghost Fleet scenario playing out, and a campaign to convince Americans it's just not worth risking nuclear war. It's just not worth risking American lives to take back a state that Hawaii can manage, or that China can manage just fine in the middle of the Pacific. So we're getting, in a sense, a preview right now of that implication of a strategic global objective that could be in the future directed towards a foreign, strategic aim, seizure of territory, or it could be in the domestic sense, targeted at reducing our ability to respond politically to a crisis at that national level, or maybe even more insidious, to convincing people that it's not a crisis. So that to me is a lot of what I would think can be easily overlooked as a really significant problem and risk, especially from a military point of view, because the civilian control paradigm, is critical, and that's part of the system that we have. And so if you can exploit that as an adversary, you can cause great harm and damage, not only in a near-term sense, but in a long-term sense. And I think with that viewpoint, it certainly is the sort of measures that I'm on guard for, and kind of thinking about the future. But I think we should be more on guard for in how we defend our country.
I'd say it plays out in 4 ways. The benefit of going second is I get to write notes down, as August has to think on the fly. So the first is just like you see with deploying a robotic system to a manufacturing line where not future, but in the past, from 1980s to 2000s, the ratio was one robot replacing 3.3 human workers on an assembly line. It's the same thing in the information space. It allows scale like never before. And so, a great illustration of that would be the Russian investment in targeting and sabotaging the 2016 US election. It was budgetary wise, the data shows that it was under, I believe the figure was $12.5 million was the budget for the Internet Research Agency. That's, get you part of a wing of an F-35. And the number of people employed is, it's in hundreds. It's not hundreds of thousands. And yet that effort reached out to not millions, not tens of millions, but for example, Facebook's own data found 146 million Americans were unknowingly exposed to Russian propaganda in the final couple months of that election. And that's a scale issue. Just as August mentioned, the same thing played out with the AstroTurf movements that started out with the open protests. You can backtrack it now and see, a very small network, the funding behind it, preset hashtags create a small turnout number of people, but you get a viral moment. And it gets covered and by the media, and it explodes, and then you get an event of 30 people reaching again hundreds of millions and shaping policy. Second thing that you get is more realistic. That's playing out with AI affecting every, so the first bots were really dumb, online bots. You could easily tell that they were bots. Now we're starting to get intelligent chat bots, whether it's on the text side or the vocal side to the visual side of deep fakes. And so that realism becomes, makes them harder to detect and gives them more influence. The third thing is more intelligent targeting. The stuff that the Russians were doing in 2016, it was like Snoopy and his biplane in World War I. What's coming now is more and more micro targeting, where it doesn't go after a whole nation, but it might be a local or state election. It also, as we talked about, it'll be that individual, what we know you react to, whether it's what colors, what emotions, will be more intelligent targeting allows you to really play that person. And then finally, more actors. Because of the low barrier to entry, because it's been proven to work, everybody's jumping into the game. And so when you see activity, you get, and this is something that Vernon plays with, you see these strange coalitions, maybe not coordinating, but definitely working in cohesion. You see foreign governments and far right and far left extremists coming together. They may have what seems like a totally different ideology, and yet they're reinforcing and aiding each other. And, again, not to plot spoil, but we play with that in the book of you get these disparate groups that you wouldn't normally think are actually working alongside each other because of this, and also because in general, they want the same thing, which is to fight the future. And, you could see this again, in some of the most recent, how you have this like protest in Huntington Beach, and it's like something out of sci-fi, right? You've got neo-Nazis and far-right extremists and, vegan anti-vaxxers and long-haired surfers all showing up at the same thing. And then it's being amplified out by, everything from Russian military intelligence to Chinese bots to the rest of us. that sounds like a scene sci-fi. That's the present, let alone what comes in the future.
Okay, so it's just about 13:45, so I'm going to transition now to the Q&A so we have enough time to get to some of the questions. We're not going to get to all of them. There are a ton. But we'll start with this one from Joe A. Do you see the weaponization of social media and fictional intelligence as the modernization of subversion, akin to espionage and sabotage being conducted at immense scale in cyberspace? And where do you see the similarities and what are the important differences?
I'll jump on that first, August. It's yes, you see these patterns. You actually see the literal playbook just updated for this modern era. And since what it does is often put these age-old strategies on steroids, whether it's the physical side of monkey wrenching. Someone, placing a physical object of sabotage. Back in the day, maybe you want to destroy a factory. You can only do it at that one place. Now, because of Internet of Things, maybe you can do it from a distance, and you can do it on scale. Same thing with disinformation. Everything that Russia did in 2016 and is doing today and planning to hit the election, but oh, by the way, mirrored by domestic actors, is a repeat of what was called Project Infection with a K, which was the KGB operation back during the Cold War to falsely blame the US military for the creation of AIDS. It involved all the same aspects, planting a false story, empathetic or sympathetic media outlets that some of which were front, some of which were what they called useful idiots, someone who had their own domestic agenda but would elevate that false story. Faux experts weighing in. It had all of it. The difference is it took the KGB roughly 3 years to reach 1/100th of what a person working for the modern version, it would take them an hour, and they could reach, orders of magnitude greater. So the playbook's the same. You can just do a lot more with it.
Here's another interesting aspect too, I think, which is the decentralization of that playbook, and that many of the same tools that we're seeing wielded by the PLA or the MSS or Russian overseas actors are effectively available to Pete and I, to any of you who are dialed in. And that distribution of particularly machine learning and neural net capability, whether it's leveraging commercial cloud, whether it's leveraging open source data from social media, allows for that kind of, I love that term, monkey wrenching. And also creation of fear, uncertainty, doubt, through means that are all waged from effectively a tablet or a phone. Now, to put my optimist hat on, because I do have that bone in my body, I would like to say that same technology, particularly around neural nets, natural language processing, you can identify what's real and what's fake much easier. Deep fakes are going to challenge us. Deep fakes are going to be certainly part of, especially when we get to augmented reality, a very kind of curated form of division and dissent, but also, if it's used correctly, will allow people to understand when they're being lied to. The old adage, how do you tell a politician's lying? They're opening their mouth. Obviously that's a bit crass, but the point is you're going to have that kind of a detector that will allow you through, the various sensors and systems that are out there, let alone software, to get a much better read, if you will, on the narratives, not just the words that are being pushed towards you. That may help build resiliency. That may help, create the kind of strength and depth that we'll need if we are looking at the future in this great power context. And it does come down to the kind of shooting conflict that I think everyone would like to avoid. But if we were to, end up in that kind of a trap, to not have addressed these kinds of shortcomings would really, I think, court defeat.
Yeah, and the short version of that, August, is the bad guys have to work in the dark. The good guys play out in the open, and they can also talk about it in the open and share in the open, whether it's you're detecting this on your network. It looks just like what I saw on my network. And everything I just said could apply to a classic cyber threat to an information operation. But it goes back to, you know, kind of it's not just about the technology, it's about the politics. It's about the bureaucracy allowing you to do that. It's about the awareness of the problem, either among the senior policymaker to the public, saying, oh, this is what's happening. This is what this means.
Our next question comes from Drew Brooks. He asks, how do intelligence agencies need to adapt their understanding of denial and deception in a world of weaponized social media?
I'll jump on that. It runs the gamut. In Like War, we talked about how there were essentially 4, you know, rules of how you operate in Like War and in this new world. And, you know, one, for example, that applies to intelligence communities was the play on the X-Files. The truth is out there. Open source intelligence is of greater availability and value than it gets credence for within intelligence community circles, but also, by the way, among policymakers and public. You get all these things where they'll be like, you know, CIA report said, you know, leaked, and you're like, that's been out there, we've, you know, known it. But so everything, you know, open source intelligence. But also another was the idea that virality trumps veracity, that it's not just what is true matters, but whether it's going viral or not. Truth can go viral, but it's the virality that gives it the impact on policy, that gives it impact on the battlefield. If you think about you know, the balance of forces between ISIS and its opponents, you could numeric count it, but it was the virality that gave ISIS that magnified effect. So there was a series of lessons like that. I think the biggest is just simply put, like in everything else, to update what we think is important and our processes for the world as it is, rather than what we wish it to be. And that might be how we change our monitoring of threats. I saw someone on the chat, you know, talking about the example of Estonia, and Estonia's done everything from, and they're a great example of a democracy that's gone after these problems. They have a digitized economy. They've got they've got digital literacy. They're training people to learn to discern between truth and fact in a way that we don't in the US. But also their intelligence community doesn't just count tanks across the border. They count information warfare attacks. And in fact, even though they've had the experience of actually having Russian tanks roll over them, they worry as much or more about the info ops side. And so I think those are some of the areas to catch us up. And you know, just like we would have 20 years ago for computers mattered, or if you were running an intelligence community, you know, 100 years back, hey, maybe we ought to pay attention to these things called flying machines.
You know, there's a whole aspect to the era we're in of Internet of Things that is only going to accelerate to, you know, produce more data than obviously any individual can parse or analyze. So the human machine teaming in the intelligence community to essentially, you know, crunch data like that to be pointed in the right direction is going to have to be a staple of, you know, the analytics and even the operational side of things out there too, and pushing that AI technology closer to the edge, you know, more onto the person, more onto the device that's portable, is going to be a feature of kind of sub-threshold, or let's just call it a regular warfare to use the DoD context. And like with the soft community, there is this whole question about how we use that open source commercially available information. You know, there is an update to humanitarian law of armed conflict, I think, that's necessary for, you know, this era of like online and autonomous conflict, but particularly when it comes to what data is fair game and what is not in that great power context. I think one of the biggest problems, you know, we can run into is being, particularly in a campaign in Europe, where very dense, very narrative driven, you know, operations and campaigns would be a hallmark of, let's say, repulsing a Russian attack into the Baltics or Northern Europe, the Arctic area. You know, where can we go to get information when we can't move aircraft or even use, you know, space assets to see what's going on? Can you go to the data that comes from someone's shoes, from their toilets, you know, from their, obviously their social media accounts? and how kinetic can that information become, to use a phrase. And so I think that sort of a debate and conversation could allow the defense community, the intelligence community to lead, in fact, on the ethical use of information at a time when the private sector tends to lag, right? The private sector's use of data for, creating economic value, tends to get shored up after something bad has happened. And I think there's a chance for the government to step out in front of it that I'd like to see happen.
So our next question comes from one of your biggest fans out there. Luke Shabro asks, one of the things you highlighted in Ghost Fleet was the blending between new technologies and legacy systems. And at Mad Scientists, we're always trying to find what's the newest technology coming out, what's going to be at the edge in 20, 30 years. So what do you think will be a legacy technology that'll be prominent in the future?
I'll start with that. There's this question, what is the value of mass, in great power conflict in the future when, the swarm, is a new way of reframing that. I would like to say, for example, that the way we move heavy things around the world, the C-17, to use one platform-based example, is still going to be really important to be able to do that quickly. We may not be able to do it at scale because of the threat environment and the threat bubbles that are going to be developed in the Pacific, or that exist in the Pacific or in Europe. So we're going to have to see those sorts of platforms evolve and become more capable to be able to move material and people, even in small amounts, into very dangerous areas. And that is a fusion of old and new. You can't create a virtual Ranger regiment, to get it into, let's say, Northern Europe. At the same time, I think that some of the ways we employ those capabilities has to change, and they may take on technological advances that seem out of step. Could you create a electronic warfare version, for example, of a large transport plane so it can get into a small road in Northern Europe? Those sorts of incremental changes could have potentially a very step function improvements in kind of operational success, especially if it is also layered on top of social media and other information domains that kind of invert some of the paradigms we have today, so that you're hiding in plain sight more than you are trying to kind of follow the 20th century rules of concealment and deception.
I'll weigh in and give a cheesy answer. It's the Mark I eyeball. It's the human ability to discern that we still see, and this will, an ever improving AI recognition systems, processing, pulling in data sources from all around. But there is still this innate human ability that in some situations is going to be better. And so for us, what we particularly play with and burn in is the real question moving forward is the nature of human machine teaming and what works best and in what situations. And you have wildly different human machine teaming types, so August introduces mass. That comes from one type, which is the kind of the swarm. I push mass numbers out there, be it with a small sensor bots, or I'm changing the way that I do logistics delivery. At the other end of the spectrum is the Air Force plan for a robotic wingman. It's just like you, just running alongside you. You have other visions that it's more like a police dog. It's with me, but I'm tasking it out for certain things. What I'm getting at is that I think in a lot of situations, not just now, but for the foreseeable future, we will the legacy system that will matter most is the human. But again, it's going to be the human working with a machine of some kind.
So we're bumping up against 1400 here. So this last question is going to come from Matt Sanaspert. I want to give you guys a chance to tell us what are we missing? What are the DoD and the Army not talking about in this realm? And August, I'll go to you. Actually, Pete, I'll go to you first because August has been.
No, I made the look of trying to think about it and hoping that you would take August and said, what are we missing? I think we're missing how the Gibson quote, "The future's already here. It's just unevenly distributed." I think we continue to believe that this stuff is in the realm of science fiction, or, with the Secretary of the Treasury, Steve Mnuchin, saying, it doesn't matter because it's only going to be, quote, 50 to 100 years from now, end quote. I think we kind of tip our hat at the concept of AI, including in the military, but don't really want to wrestle with its real implications right now. And that we, spend too much time on the science fiction stuff of the killer robots rather than everything that we've just talked about. How does it change everything from the tool that the individual soldier has out in the field, either it's an unmanned system or it's a decision aid? How does it change how we do training? How does it change doctrine? How do we alter our acquisition system to reflect the fact that AI is not fantasy, it's real right now? Not just how do you buy it, how do you use it in acquisition? You name it, to larger issues of what does it mean in the hands of our adversaries? Does it allow them to achieve strategic surprise? To what does it mean to the larger political context that militaries operate in? Both at home and abroad. And that's what I think they missed. And that's what motivated us from the start of this project, was to, tell a cool story, but also hope plug some of those gaps that we see out there in the discourse and understanding.
I'll riff on that. And I'd say the ability to understand that the same forces that are transforming not just the commercial world with AI and robotics, but also society, will be equally, if not more, transformational for the armed forces of the United States. And that has everything to do with something as foundational as budget, and where our nation's military fits into our America's priorities in the next decade, and the decade beyond that, when we see a lot more consideration of spending on entitlement programs just to keep our country functioning and together. And the second is just that automation that is, of course, headline stealing when it comes to the Terminator robot, will probably be more profound on logistics and maintenance and these out of sight applications that have huge implications, though, for force structure, for basing, for kind of wading back into that really, really turbulent water where the politics of procurement become, and authorization and appropriation become elemental to how we fund the force. And so I feel like that requires a lot more study than we give airtime to, in part because it lacks the kind of headline grabbing aspects of killer robots, but is probably even more profound for the future of the US military.
So we are a little bit past 1400. I don't want to, but I have to cut this at this point. We have still 37 questions unanswered. So that just shows how interested everybody is. I want to thank everybody who attended today and who showed extreme professionalism, not commenting on my quarantine haircut and facial hair. I appreciate that. I want to say thank you to our guests, August Cole and Peter Singer, authors of Burn-In, which came out yesterday. They've been huge allies to the Mad Scientist program. We're always happy to have them. I also want to add that our previous virtual event that we ran last week with Mr. Vincent O'Neill on the information disruption industry and the OE of the future is available on our YouTube page if you'd like to check it out. Also, next week, we'll have another one of these with Dr. Merrick Posard and Dr. Christopher Paul on June 3rd. They're from the RAND Corporation. They're going to be presenting on AI and manufacturing reality. So stay tuned to all the Mad Scientist channels, the laboratory, the Twitter, and you can find out information on how to sign up for that. And I don't know if it was shown in the chat, but I want to make clear that the views expressed today do not necessarily reflect those of the Department of Defense, Department of the Army, Army Futures Command, or Training and Doctrine Command. And before we leave, I just want to give August and Peter a chance. Where can people see your work? Where can people get in touch with you on Twitter, LinkedIn? What's best?
So first, I want to thank you and everyone else behind the scenes that not just invited us, but put the logistics together of this. And thank everybody as well for joining us. You can find out more about the Burn-In project at burninbook.com. And, you know, it has everything from the fun reviews to a video trailer, again, very different for fiction and nonfiction, to discussion questions that we've been hitting on, to even an accompanying music list. And the book is available at all the great places that you would normally buy books at, just now online. And so really appreciate the opportunity to talk about it and share it with you, and hope you give it a chance.
Yeah, you can find us on Twitter. We're on LinkedIn. You know, our respective websites, augustcole.com, pwsinger.com. And some of the short stories that I mentioned are on my website if you want to take a look at those, and don't hesitate to reach out. And thank you again for having us, and also just for tackling this really difficult challenge.
All right. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, everybody. We're going to end here. Please follow Mad Scientist at Army MadSci, and check the blog out, madsciblog.tradoc.army.mil. And hopefully we'll see everyone next week. Thank you.